Following the Trento and Zara classes, the Regia Marina was supposed to be done with the production of heavy cruisers, at least according to their own original program, envisaging 6 heavy cruisers, 2 Trentos, and 4 Zaras. This 7th, which turned out to be the Bolzano, was planned when it became clear that Pola, one of the 4 Zaras, should serve as the flagship until the Giulio Cesare or the Conte de Cavour recommissioned following their extensive refit. With this 7th cruiser, the Regia Marina could operate 2 heavy cruiser divisions consisting of 3 cruisers each. In her service, Bolzano was used in fleet reviews for dignitaries and escorting the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini to Italy's African colonies. Initially serving with Trento and Trieste, participating in the Battle of Calabria, and being damaged in the process. Later going on to take part in the Battle of Cape Matapan, surviving an attack from the British submarine Triumph, and then after an aborted attack on Operation Pedestal, she was hit and crippled by the small submarine HMS Unbroken. After, she never saw service again. When it comes to the design of the Bolzano, I'll be taking from Mussolini's Navy a reference guide to the Regia Marina, 1930 to 1945 by Maurizio Brescia. He writes, Bolzano, albeit built when the Zaras were in the final stages of fitting out, should be more similar to the Trentos to enable them to operate together more efficiently. Contrary to this, there's evidence that Bolzano was built because of lobbying on behalf of the Ansaldo yard, which had been left out of the heavy cruiser program until then, as well as the continued belief in parts of the high command of the Regia Marina that speed was a more important factor than robustness or protection. Bolzano's design was an improved version of the Trentos. Nevertheless, her design took from the Zaras as well, notably taking the forecastle found in the Zaras, as well as the improved 8-inch 53 caliber guns found in the previous class, not to mention the aircraft catapult found amidships between the funnels. The secondary battery was planned to be 16 4.7-inch guns and twin mountings, later reduced to 12, with the lighter anti-aircraft weaponry being similar to that found on the Zaras. In the profile, from a distance, Bolzano resembled Pola because of their similar bridge structure, being a less complex design fairing into the forefunnel. Like many other Regia Marina vessels we've talked about, speed was a main aspect of the design. With 10 boilers and 4 shafts, the machinery was enough to deliver 150,000 shaft horsepower for a maximum speed of 33 knots. As for armor, Bolzano had less compared to the much more balanced designs of the Zaras, with the waterline belt reduced to 70mm and the deck reduced to 50mm. Again, quoting here, a speed of only 2 knots higher than that of the Zaras did not compensate for the general weakness of the ship, which only a short time after her commissioning began to be called an error beautifully executed, given the attention lavished on her design. To describe her particulars, she was laid down on the 11th of June 1930, launched on August 31st, 1932, and completed on August 19th, 1933. She displaced 11,065 tons standard displacement and a full load displacement of 13,885 tons. As for machinery, she had the 10 boilers as I mentioned earlier, giving steam to 4 shafted geared turbines, producing around 150,000 shaft horsepower, enabling her to reach a top speed of 33 knots in operational conditions. As for her trial, she achieved 36.8 knots at a little under her standard displacement. She had a cruising endurance of almost 17,000 nautical miles. Her armor was similar to that of the Trentos, having a waterline belt of 70mm, a main deck of 50mm, a conning tower armor thickness of 100mm, and the turrets had a face thickness of 80mm. As for armament, she carried 8 203mm 8-inch 53 caliber guns and 4 twin turrets, with 2 super-firing forward and 2 super-firing aft. Originally, she was to be fit with 16 120mm 4.7-inch 47 caliber guns and twin turrets. After 1937, she carried 12 of these. As for anti-aircraft armament, she carried 8 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 8 13.2mm anti-aircraft guns. In 1942, she was refitted to carry 8 20mm light anti-aircraft guns. Along with these were 2 quadruple torpedo tubes. Finally, she carried 2 float planes. Upon commissioning, she joined Trento and Trieste in Cruiser Division 1, and during the 1930s she participated in several fleet reviews for various foreign dignitaries, even serving as an escort vessel for the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini on a trip to Italian Libya in 1937. Upon the start of the Second World War, Bolzano was still with the 2 Trentos in a different cruiser division, fighting in one of the most important early actions of the war in the Mediterranean, the Battle of Calabria. In early July, as part of the re-establishment of Malta as a major base in the Mediterranean for the British, it was decided to reduce the number of non-combatant servicemen and dependents on the island. These were removed in 2 small convoys. Admiral Andrew Cunningham was to interpose his Mediterranean fleet between the convoys and the likely direction of the approach of the Italian surface forces. Simultaneously, Force H would create a diversion by raiding Cagliari in Sardinia. Coincidentally, a 5-ship Italian convoy left Naples on July 6th, bound for Benghazi, supported by 2 light cruisers and destroyers. Once word reached the Italian high command of the British move towards Malta, 2 battleships, the Giulio Cesare and the Conte de Cavour, along with 2 cruiser divisions, including the Bolzano, were added to the covering force. Early on the 8th, the small British vessel Phoenix spotted the main Italian force. The convoy eventually reached North Africa, bolstering the Italians with some 2,000 troops and around 16,000 tons of supplies. The Italian covering force turned eastward at 3 p.m. to meet the British. The latter headed roughly northwestwards, being about midway between the Dodecanese and Libya, when on the 8th, Admiral Cunningham's force was bombed by Italian high-level bombers, hitting the cruiser Gloucester. Malta-based recon planes had the Italian fleet under almost constant surveillance, and with the British convoys sailing delayed, Cunningham steered for Taranto to get ahead of the Italians' homeward route. Through the decoding of British telegrams, the Italians expected Cunningham to be off the Calabrian coast at noon on the 9th. Taking from The War in the Mediterranean by Bernard Ireland, he writes, "At 7:30 a.m. on the 9th, the enemy main body was reported only 50 miles from Cape Spartivento, the toe of Italy, handy for the sanctuary of the Messina Strait. Cunningham, with an injured cruiser and 4 others down to 50% ammunition, faced 6 8-inch cruisers and 8 6-inch cruisers, and his speed was limited by the 21.5 knots of the Royal Sovereign. He was heading into a northwesterly breeze with a slight sea and cloud-dappled sky. Each of the 3 elements of his force was separated by 8 miles from its neighbor. Early in the afternoon, HMS Eagle deployed Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers. With the pilots lacking experience against fast-moving targets in the open sea, they only managed to harass the Italians. Turning towards the Italians at 2:15 p.m., the first action of the day began with Admiral Tovey's cruisers and the Italian cruisers. The 6-inch guns of the British were outranged by the Italians, and Tovey was forced to fall back, with both HMS Malaya and Warspite forcing the pursuing Italian cruisers to retreat. The balance of the battle shifted again when at 3:50 the Italian battleships entered the fray, straddling the British battleships, with Warspite hitting Giulio Cesare at 3:59 p.m. During this time, the cruisers on both sides were engaged in a fierce gunnery duel. Bolzano was struck 3 times by 6-inch shells, in the process damaging her steering gear and an 8-inch gun turret. Admiral Camoni, not knowing the full extent of the damage to his battleship, took no chances and altered his course to the Straits of Messina. Following this action, Bolzano found herself in another famous battle in the Mediterranean, the Battle of Cape Matapan. By late March 1941, the war in the Mediterranean having expanded, the Regia Marina intended to sink troop convoys heading from Egypt to Greece in company with the Regia Aeronautica and the German Luftwaffe. The Italians put to sea with Admiral Aquino's flagship Vittorio Veneto and the heavy cruisers Zara, Fiume, Pola, Trieste, Trento, and Bolzano, along with a plethora of light cruisers and destroyers. To cover the convoys, Admiral Cunningham put to sea with Warspite, Valiant, Barham, and the carrier Formidable, screened by Admiral Pridham Whipple's cruisers along with destroyers. Early on the 28th, Aquino sighted Pridham Whipple by spotter plane, sending forward his heavy cruisers to contact and delay the British until his flagship could come up. At 8:12 a.m., the Italian heavy cruisers under the command of Admiral Luigi Sansonetti opened up on the British cruisers. In the ensuing 40-minute battle, the Italian guns were accurate, forcing the British cruisers to weave and dodge their shots. But at 8:55, Aquino recalled the cruisers due to the weak air cover by the Germans, which had not really materialized. Seeing that no British convoys had come, Aquino began to withdraw. Pridham Whipple, eager to pursue the retreating enemy, reverted to the cruiser role of track and report, out of the range of the Italian guns. Emboldened by the lack of aerial activity and hoping to catch the British off guard, Aquino suddenly reversed course at 10:35 a.m. Using the 15-inch guns of Vittorio Veneto and the 8-inch guns of Sansonetti's cruisers, he began a withering attack on the British cruisers. Fortunately for Pridham Whipple, Cunningham had ordered an attack using Formidable's aircraft, eventually forcing the Italians to disengage. The rest of the day saw Bolzano and the rest of the Italian fleet under air attack from Royal Navy and Royal Air Force planes. Bolzano made it out of the action relatively unscathed, as compared to some of the other Italian heavy cruisers, which were destroyed in the night action. I covered this in my video on HMS Barham. Following the battle, she made her way back to Italy, and later that year, on August 26th, she was torpedoed and damaged in the Straits of Messina by HMS Triumph, limping to Genoa where she was repaired. Leading us to early August of 1942, where Operation Pedestal, an effort by the Royal Navy to bring 14 merchant vessels to the besieged island of Malta, as the island was under almost constant air attack from both Italian and German planes. Leaving for Malta on the 9th, under the command of Acting Vice Admiral Neville Seifert, the convoy had already suffered a large blow with the sinking of HMS Eagle. To compound this, the Regia Marina was putting together a force of cruisers to attack the Pedestal fleet. This combined group of 3 heavy cruisers and 3 light cruisers, escorted by 11 destroyers, was to steer and intercept through the darkness to fall upon whatever remained of the Pedestal fleet early on the morning of the 13th off Pantelleria, 60 miles to the southwest of Sicily. However, the various groups of cruisers and destroyers had not met up yet, and as they were venturing to their rendezvous points, the Italian High Command hesitated, as they feared not only the remaining escorts of the Pedestal fleet, but any air attack that could possibly come from Malta. Max Hastings' Operation Pedestal, the fleet that battled Malta in 1942, he writes, "It was decided to refer the issue direct to Mussolini. The Duce was invited to make a personal determination, whether his beloved fleet should risk all, as the Italians saw it, by attacking Pedestal or return to port. Characteristically, he made the latter choice. At 1:56 a.m. on the 13th, the Italian 3rd Cruiser Squadron set a new course towards Naples, while the 7th Cruiser Squadron headed for Messina. Instead of a death blow to the already weakened Pedestal fleet, a junior officer in the Royal Navy seized the opportunity and struck back at the Italians with the submarine HMS Unbroken. Lieutenant Alistair Mars was a 27-year-old with his first command being HMS Unbroken, one of the smallest submarines in the Royal Navy. The entire crew was comprised of 32 officers and men. Mars's orders, along with 7 other British submarines operating across the region, were drawn up to intercept Italian warships if they were put to sea. Unbroken spent the night of August 8th surfaced near Longobardi, watching the railroad some 1,500 yards away, being so close that they could see the candles and homes. The crew of the submarine's deck gun excitedly spotted a train heading their way at 10:10 p.m., this not being their target as they were supposed to attack goods wagons heading south to assist Rommel's armies in North Africa. And at 10:45 they spotted their target. Heading to just 900 yards away, Unbroken's 3-inch gun sounded out in the dark night, battering the track and the train engine, breaking off its shelling just 2 minutes later and slipping silently back into the darkness. While they headed out towards their rendezvous point with other British submarines that were to await Italian cruiser squadrons if they were put to sea. Now, Unbroken was deployed as a backstop on the likely route the Italians would take home. The early hours of August 9th saw the tiny British submarine off the coast of Messina, just 18 miles away from the Italian naval base, when at 9 a.m. they detected the noise of propellers, but could not exactly place what it was. This mysterious ship ended up being a patrol tug that began a depth charge attack, forcing Mars to 80 feet below the surface. The explosion shook the hull of the tiny craft. The attacks persisted until 3 p.m., with the temperatures in the little submarine reaching 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Mars writes, "My clothes were soaked in sweat, the air in the boat was thick and oily, and my nerves were in a wretched state. If only we had been able to hit back. If only there had been some movement or action to take our minds off the agony of the situation. But no, we could only wait and hope and pray, brooding and exaggerating, picturing a torn, smashed hull and bubbling, choking, lung-bursting death." Mars resisted the urge to bring his boat back up to periscope depth as his tormentors moved away. He eventually decided to move 30 miles to the northwest to watch the sea between the islands of Stromboli and Salina, where the cruisers must pass if they were headed towards the port of Messina. The next several days saw the boat linger in the area, passing the night of the 10th as well as the 11th and 12th, with almost nothing to mention. However, in the early hours of the 13th, they received the message that Wellington bombers out of Malta had spotted Italian cruisers off Sicily's Cape de Gallo, steering east at 20 knots. Almost every other British submarine was at sea in the central Mediterranean, many miles away, south of Pantelleria, while Unbroken was in a perfect position to intercept these ships. The Italian ships were due to reach Unbroken's position at 7:30 in the morning. Initially, Mars thought about heading back to Cape Milazzo, but he understood that Admiral de Zara, in charge of the Italian force, once spotted by the aircraft, would change course, and thus de Zara would have to turn to port. The tiny submarine stayed where it was, while eating a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs when the hydrophone operator called out that he had heavy units approaching their position. Mars, swinging his periscope around, initially saw nothing in the morning haze. The cruisers were big, but still distant. Returning to the periscopes, Mars writes, "My heart thumped like a trip hammer, but I noticed with satisfaction that my hands were steady and my eyes were clear. Then I saw them as their masts broke through the haze on the horizon. In my joy, I could have danced a jig." Spotting the Italian cruisers on the horizon, Mars dropped the large periscope and brought up the smaller, less conspicuous one. Maneuvering his boat into position, his attack could be spoiled by any of the Aztec operators aboard the 8 Italian destroyers escorting the cruisers. Although this did not happen as Mars's luck held, and with this now or never moment, Mars steered his boat into position to attack the most accessible target, one of the 2 heavy cruisers. As Italian ships passed overhead, just a little past 8 in the morning, Mars saw his window, firing a spread of 4 torpedoes at what turned out to be the Bolzano. I'll let Max Hastings tell you what happens next, as he describes the attack beautifully. The telltale bubbles and surging wakes of Mars's torpedoes were spotted running by lookouts aboard the destroyer Fucilieri and the cruisers Bolzano and Gorizia, all of which began to turn to comb the tracks. Bolzano was nonetheless struck amidships, precipitating a thunderous explosion that flooded engine rooms and a magazine, starting a major fire that spread from an oil tank. The 6-inch cruiser Muzio Attendolo saw her neighbor's plight and also began to take evasive action, again too late. The detonation of another of Unbroken's torpedoes tore an 82-foot gash in the light cruiser's bow. Black smoke began billowing out of the hull and the superstructure of the Bolzano, with some of the crew leaping into the water. These men were rescued by small boats piloted by old men, crew, women, and even children from the nearby shore. Men like Vincenzo Constantino, the second trumpeter aboard the Bolzano, had been eating and drinking as the attack came, with the lower decks almost immediately filling with a choking black smoke. He and numerous other men, filled with panic, blindly made their way to the open deck. Upon reaching it, Constantino called out for the first trumpeter. I shouted for help, calling the name of Beato, our senior trumpeter. On the deck, it was hell, with dead and wounded men being carried aft, their burns covered in a black cream. Then Beato came, and we headed for the stern. When the torpedo and boiler explosions lashed the ship, men were hit with a flame that inflicted severe burns on them. These desperate men with burnt faces fell as they sought to flee. Men were trapped on either the front or the rear of the ship, as the wind shifted around, opening a gap in the flames, which allowed men trapped forward to dash towards the safer stern. Many men feared that their ship was doomed, including the captain Luigi Merzagora. Remaining calm, he hailed the destroyer Santa Barbara alongside to not only take off wounded, but shells as they were in danger of detonating from the menacing fire, with the forward magazine being flooded. Destroyers attempted to tow the cruiser, but not before the captain called the crowd of sailors on the ship's stern to escape the fires. Constantino describes the scene. "Men, whose is the Bolzano?" They shouted back, "Ours!" Then the captain cried out, "I salute the king, I salute the Duce, abandon ship." Hundreds of men leapt from the cruiser onto the adjoining deck of the destroyer. Mars and Unbroken rode out the hail of depth charge attacks that came following his attack. Lurking in the deep, his boat endured 10 hours of attacks and well over 100 depth charges. When the Italians sailed away, the triumphant little submarine surfaced, and the crew was finally able to have relief from the stifling heat. In all, the little submarine caused Muzio Attendolo's bow to fall off while under tow to Messina, and after that, never putting to sea again. While the Bolzano burned all day and was temporarily beached ashore and then towed to La Spezia. Count Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law and Minister for Foreign Affairs, described the attack in his diary. "It appears that things are developing well for us, but we have paid a high price, with the loss of Bolzano and the damage suffered by the Attendolo." Being refloated in September and towed to La Spezia for permanent repairs, an interesting plan was developed for the damaged ship, hoping to convert her into an aircraft launching ship, but by early 1943, work on the cruiser would cease altogether. The ship would be abandoned by the Italians on the 9th of September, 1943. The Germans later began to dismantle her. On June 21, 1944, Bolzano was damaged and sunk by a British chariot in the Gulf of La Spezia, which was a manned torpedo used by the Royal Navy in the Second World War. Certainly an interesting weapon to look into if you have the time. She would be found by the advancing Allied forces in La Spezia, partially submerged at the end of the war, being refloated and then quickly broken up. I'm interested to hear if you all would like me to cover more Regia Marina ships. They have fascinating designs and are some of the most beautiful ships of the period, but I struggle with finding sources to do my typical videos on them, so if anyone could recommend some sources for operational histories for the Regia Marina, it would be greatly appreciated. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it will help the channel to grow, and until next time my friends, have a great day.